Right. Oh, hi, everyone. Amanda Jewar here, Executive Director of Strength Counseling Services. Thank you for tuning in. Today, we are providing you with another story submission, and today we have Anna. Anna, welcome. We are excited to hear your story. I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you for having me. I am excited to be here today. Um, So I guess where I should begin at the beginning. I am 37 years old. Got to check my birth date on that one. And I was born in a small city in the Prairie provinces, and I was born into an alcoholic household. And as I grew up, I struggled a lot with feeling comfortable. My father was present in the home. He was emotionally unavailable. He would, his drinking, his bouts of alcoholism progressed throughout the years to episodes of psychoses. And my mom really held everything together as best she could. There was always meals on the table, the laundry was always done. She was running her own business. I spent a lot of time with my family and my cousins growing up down the road, and she really was the one holding everything together. But there was a lot of anger, a lot of screaming, a lot of arguments in the household, and I just found it very difficult to be a part of my family unit. And I remember being angry that I was alive as almost as far back as I can remember. And I used to say to my parents, "Why did you have me? I didn't choose to be here. Why did you have me? If you didn't want to be present, if you didn't want to be better than who you were." And my father refused to quit drinking. It didn't matter what the impact on the household was. And my father was a very successful man. He was an entrepreneur, and he's what you would call someone who is a functional alcoholic. And he believed there was nothing wrong with alcoholism and that it was something that had to be controlled. And I remember he quit once for a year by himself with no help. And then he returned to drinking a year later. I don't have a lot of memories from my childhood. I have enough, but I don't have a lot of detailed pieces. I remember being a very lonely child, and I was always very isolated in my room. I didn't feel like I had a lot of emotional support, even in these big escalating fights. And I was an extremely angry child, quite a bit of deviant behaviors, and not a lot of awareness about it, but I knew that I had pain and was just very angry. And that anger progressed throughout my teenage years. And in high school, I began smoking pot daily. I had acquired a pretty good friend group by then, and there was some sense of normalcy. I would smoke a lot of pot in grade 12, but still I was a member of the outdoors club, and I had some connection, and I had some semblance of a good life, even though I was living in this alcoholic household. Definitely, there's a lot of hypervigilance. I could tell just the way, by the way, my father opened the door, whether or not he was going to come in drunk. And as soon as he was home, I just scattered. If we had a fight, I don't ever remember anyone coming to check on me to see if I was okay. And I didn't know what to do with all of my pain. It was just there. But I remember wanting not to feel at all and believing that it was strength to be numb, to not feel anything, and wanting to turn all of my human emotional functions off. And it was just the way it was for a long time. When I had graduated high school, I graduated with just barely squeaking by. I didn't apply myself, didn't study greatly, and didn't have a lot of self esteem by the time I reached my young adulthood. And that was time for me to discover who I was in the world. It was just a very, very confusing and difficult time for me. I was going to university at the behest of my family, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was working for my family business, but I had no work ethic. I didn't show up half the time. I did what I wanted, and I had no value for the privileges that I did have in life. And I didn't know the value of a dollar. And eventually, when I was 20 years old, I moved to another city with some of my girlfriends and began drinking more. It's my first time out of the house, my first time learning to cook, and doing a lot of recreational drug use. Then drinking. And at this point in time in my life, I was always worried that I would become an alcoholic. And I was always really paranoid about that. And I didn't actually like any type of drug use. It made me very uncomfortable. I was much more comfortable with alcohol, but I worried and I would watch how much of a craving I had for a drink throughout the week. And even then, there were sometimes I felt like I couldn't stop. And so I would test myself. I would quit for a couple weeks and then go back to drinking. And I started becoming concerned because the drugs I was using, if they were around, they were in the room, it was something that I couldn't pass up. And I was in my first serious relationship and my mental health just plummeted. By the end of it, I left to return home and I was definitely suicidal and traumatized from my experiences there. I returned home, my mental health was really bad, panic attacks. There were some times where I would be having to leave classrooms where I wouldn't be able to have another human being look at me. I had to hide in small, dark spaces. I would have traumatic dreams, and I was just white knuckling it and holding on through this pain. What I know now is that I had the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, but I didn't know that. In my household, there wasn't a lot of education around mental health. There was a lot of emphasis on getting good grades and going into sports and achievements, but there wasn't really a lot of room to talk about mental health. And on my father's side of the family, I really felt very spotted. And it felt like a very invalidating environment, especially because my other cousins, my other family members, they didn't have any of this going on. And I didn't feel comfortable. And I didn't feel like there was room given to allow me to just be me. And that really deepened my own sense of shame and disconnection. And like I was different. And in a lot of my friends' household, there wasn't this same flavor of chaos. And I felt very alone. I felt very isolated, even coming back home. And my dad was still drinking. We had next to no relationship in any type of positive way. And we pretty much just fought a lot. And so there I was returning home, really struggling with a lot of the symptoms of trauma and not knowing what to do. And I became really hyper vigilant, really sick, but just trying to stay strong and being able to resist all of the ups and downs of life. And I was still always um, possibly suicidal, still very much, "Oh, I don't wanna live," no fear of death, no value for life. In fact, I was afraid of living, and I didn't recognize that as its own form of depression, but very much just disenchanted with life. And when I would have these breakdowns and these panic attacks, and I would have to hide in closets and wait for those moments of panic to pass, that was always my out, was that, "Oh, I could just kill myself." That was comforting, and so that chronic emptiness was with me for so long. When I was 23, I was in a relationship briefly, and it was 4 months, and this guy had broken up with me, and I was just absolutely devastated, and I went to a fortune teller, of all people. She was doing a card reading for me, and that woman, what she said to me changed my life. And as she was reading my cards, she looked at me and she told me that I needed to begin healing myself because otherwise I would be 40 and divorced with 2 kids. And that was one of the most impactful things anyone had ever said to me. And I went home and I looked at myself and I just hated myself. There was so much hate and shame, and it was just so all engulfing. I remember sitting there in my parents' living room with this piece of paper that I had written down of everything that I hated about myself, and I could not come up with anything that I liked about myself. And it was from that point forward that I started trying to do some work, trying to get some counseling, and I went and started counseling with my university, not knowing, once again, anything about counseling or the different frameworks or fields. And I remember this first counselor that I went to go see. At one point, she said, "I think you have an attachment disorder." And I said, "What was that?" And a lot of the work that I was doing was just on being able to connect the dots around like why anger was wrong and why these violent storms and angry temperaments were actually not the way I wanted to be able to exist in the world. And I just couldn't connect the two in so many respects. It was normal for me. And so there was about 10 sessions there that I attended, and I went to see another counselor. I don't remember any counselor ever talking to me about medication, why I needed to be on medication, what the benefits of that were, and that I might have an access 1, access 2 disorder, that I might have some serious mental health issues. And so I just kept trying to stay afloat, and this was throughout my 20s. By that time, I had I'd quit doing any drugs. I'd go out with my girlfriends on the weekend. I was drinking socially, still not a lot of ambition, not a lot of work ethic. I was very much like a failure to launch type of individual. And I didn't have any faith in myself. I didn't know how to act in opposition to how I felt. And so I just existed, failing out of a lot of my university classes, getting bad grades, having to do non-credit writing courses just in order to be able to make a different grade. And it was really just it was just such a difficult time in my life. I felt like I had no purpose. I was looking at all of my good girlfriends that were getting into relationships. They were getting married, or and I didn't have any of that. I couldn't string a relationship together. I just had so many fears and so much trauma, and I didn't actually know what it was. I just knew that there was this engulfing pain inside of me that I could not regulate my emotions. I just couldn't. And I couldn't keep any relationship. And so between the explosive temper and the pain and having very little awareness of what was going on inside of me, despite having gone to a few counselors, I was just doing the best that I could with what I had. I had finished my undergraduate degree, by this time. And when this was 2003, I believe. And I had decided that I was going to go teach English in Ecuador. And I had gotten into an online master's program. So that was my plan. I was going to go to Ecuador, dropped myself into the country with 2 suitcases and a handful of resumes. And that lasted about 4 months for me. And I came back home. I came back home feeling dejected, feeling like a failure. Meanwhile, I had this online master's degree that I was starting, and that kind of gave me some hope that maybe I would be something in life. Maybe I wouldn't be this. I just didn't feel like I had a place. And at the same time, like I was terrified of this because I had improved my grades, but I still had so much doubt about what my capacity or intelligence was. And I just had so little faith in myself. And I was still living with all of this trauma, untreated PTSD, complex PTSD, I know now. And so I was just squeaking by. And at this point in time, I had met someone, and that was the beginning of the end and really truly my descent into addiction. It was a bad relationship, and I wasn't stable in it as well. And I moved in with him really quickly. I became really sick in it. So sick that my heavy drinking at that point, I was working in a bar, it slowly rolled into day-to-day drinking. And so I was trying to be what he wanted me to be, even though that wasn't what I wanted, but I didn't really feel like I had a place. I didn't have a career yet. I felt really bad about myself. I didn't know that I would ever get there. And he wanted a housewife. And so I thought, oh, I'd give it a try. And he went out and worked a lot, and I began drinking when I was cleaning the floors and to drown out the boredom. And I just felt so deeply unfulfilled, but I felt stuck because my biggest fear was to live and die alone. And so I was willing to pretty much abandon any sense of self that I had in order to try and keep this relationship, even though it was destroying me. And so I had become an alcoholic so far and so fast and so deep that it I went from being a somewhat low functioning human being to someone that was drinking equal quantities of just straight liquor, whatever I could get my hands on a day, even liquor that wasn't fit for human consumption. I was unable to shower at some points. I was just so drunk all the time, and I was just wanting to drown out reality. I was really suicidal. There was so much instability in the relationship, and I was bouncing back and forth from his house to my parents' house, and I was just so lonely. But I was just so intoxicated all the time. Showering was hard, getting up, just those activities of daily living was just so hard. And I was determined. I just wanted to drink until I didn't have to be present in reality. I just wanted to drown out all consciousness. And I was so depressed. I felt like I had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. And when I look back on that, in those moments where I lost my resiliency, I knew, I could tell, I was no longer able to withstand the highs and lows of all my mental health issues. It was like the strength had slowly been sucked out of me. And whereas once I was able to just hold on and hold through those highs and lows with some semblance of resiliency, all of that had just been slowly, my trauma was becoming higher than my resilience. And I just didn't have it anymore. And I knew what was happening to me because I was losing control. It was terrifying. I would wake up in sweats. I couldn't go more than a couple hours without a drink. And I was so intoxicated all the time, wake up shaking. And I was just in so much pain. And by this point in time, I wasn't able to perform well in school because I was drinking all the time and I would get so drunk that I couldn't remember, I couldn't study, and so I had to go on a medical sabbatical. And there was a person that I was involved with in my university that was someone that was a friend and a mentor and someone that very much had this important place in my life that was very influential. And that was really important to actually why I was even in grad school. And in my alcoholism, I would go over to his place and he had started doing a lot of pretty heavy street drugs, and I began smoking meth with him. First time was in an attempt to be able to sober up for work because I was too drunk to be able to go in. And that was really where my life began and my addiction began taking a turn. I had gone to the hospital that night because I had done so much meth, I drank so much that, like, I was just panicking, and they ended up giving me a referral to detox. And before that, I had gone to my doctor. I had told him I have a drinking problem. Meanwhile, throughout this, I have a counselor and I'm going to a counselor. And he is giving me some Ativan and saying that I need to wean myself off. And I tried that, but I just ended up snorting it with some alcohol and I just couldn't stop. I couldn't quit. It was just such a large force in my life. But I kept trying and I kept trying and I kept trying. And I went to detox. I detoxed and I thought, oh, I'm never gonna drink again, and it's not a big deal. I'm never gonna touch drugs again. And I really enjoyed my time in detox, but I was still so focused on this toxic relationship that I was in. And I came out of detox, and 2 days later, my partner and we had gone out to dinner, and he ordered a beer in front of me, and that kicked things off into a big fight. And I ended up relapsing and drinking, getting myself into a situation with someone that was very unhealthy at the time. And it was just a downward spiral from then. At that point in time, after that, I was still drinking. I hadn't touched any more drugs, but just drinking heavily, drinking probably about 2.6 to a 40 a day. And by this point, I had taken a medical sabbatical for school. I couldn't work. So I was unemployed and I was just bouncing back and forth between his house, my ex-fiance's house, and my parents' house with as much stuff as I could carry. And then it was at one point during one of these drinking binges, consecutive fights or whatever it was, there really wasn't any time where I wasn't drinking, and I tried all the medications, right, the naltrexone, the acamprosate. By this point, when I had gone to detox, they'd put me on these medications to help dial down those cravings. I'd come home, I would try and get it, but at this point, those medications weren't well known. I wasn't organized enough in order to be able to make sure that I had those prescriptions, and I would just relapse, and I would try and get a job in a bar, try and have some stability under me, and then I'd relapse again. And it was through one of these pieces where I'd gone to see my doctor and he'd given me a referral to a psychiatrist, so I was on the wait list for that. And at some point, I was really drunk. I was at my mom's house, and it was when I had taken this overdose of pills and drank a whole bunch of mouthwash in an attempt to commit suicide. Um, I don't remember a lot except I waking up in the ICU with these bright lights and these medical professionals over me, and they had put me in a medically induced coma. And they I was supposed to be out for a lot longer, but I had woken up. And I was so ill. I never felt so bad, so terrible in my life. I couldn't move. And that was that given me a medical detox. In fact, this is the only time that I've ever had a medical detox was in that ICU. And the inpatient psychiatrist had come to see me, and my family was there. And that was when she had given me the diagnosis of having borderline personality disorder. And I'll never forget that moment because everyone in my family was like, this makes so much sense when she was going through the symptomology. And it made so much sense to me. I had so many of those struggles. Um, and in that moment, getting that diagnosis was really meaningful and impactful because it was like, oh my God, it was such a relief. There is a reason. There is a reason I am like this. I actually have a legitimate reason for like why I'm so fucked up and why I just can't get it together. Like all the regular people that I see around me. And she had recommended that I go to treatment, and that psychiatrist had put a referral to one of the private treatment centers in front of me. And it was for a privatized treatment center out east. And I wasn't ready to go to treatment in part because I wasn't ready to leave my relationship. I just couldn't do it. And things were getting really bad at this time after I had gotten out of the hospital and recovered from my suicide attempt. I stayed sober for about a month. And then after that, I was over at this friend's house and I started doing meth again. I started doing it willingly and of my own volition because it numbed out the great pain. Alcohol wasn't doing it, it wasn't sufficient. And so I I'd made the choice to try it when I was trying to sober up for work. I had made the choice to start doing it again because the pain inside of me was just so great and it numbed out that pain. It also took the edge off all the alcohol, and I found that I was able to move. It was just so difficult because I was so intoxicated all the time to move and just to be able to do those basic pieces, those basic things in life. And the meth gave me energy in order to be able to do that. And it turned a lot of that pain into another layer of anger and rage. And so there's just something about it that I kept doing it. And one day when I was at that person's house, I had there was a lot of people milling through, associates, people from like the underworld, the street, lots of people entrenched in pain, and lots of other people with some pretty serious mental health and addiction issues on board. And so I had met a gang leader in one of those houses, and that was just it for me. I just was completely enraptured by him. And so we started hanging out, and he would pick me up and would go places with him, and we'd get high and we'd go see people. And I like my opening into a more severe level of my addiction. And I was just, my addiction was so out of control at that point. I was usually in a state of overdose. I was using until I was uncontrollably shaking, projectile vomiting sometimes, hallucinating, and just really the combination of the two. It was just such a profound and powerful urge. And I started doing things like stealing from my mom and pawning things at pawn shops, and in order to be able to get what I needed. And so just going against all of my values. And I started making friends in that underworld. And so even outside of these two individuals, I would go and hang out, and I would hang out because I was lonely, because I was in pain, and there was always someone there. And so I would smoke more meth there. And then what came with that whole lifestyle of just a dangerous lifestyle, where it really was like jails, institutions, and death. And so that continued on for a little while. And eventually, at one point, I had gotten into a fight with a drug dealer and over some money. He had owed me some money, and there was a pretty serious altercation there, and I ended up getting held at gunpoint. And I told him just pull the trigger. At that point, I had no fear of death. I never wanted to live, and so living was much, much more fearful for me than death. And so he didn't, and I left. And I ended up going to another house, picking up more drugs, and going home to my mom's house. And my dad had this gun case. And at this point, I had spent 2 days just drinking and snorting and smoking a lot of meth by myself. I'd spent 2 days talking to a little man in my computer, just completely in a psychosis, not really aware of any type of reality. And I thought that my home was being invaded in this psychosis. I thought that I was going to be murdered. And I had gotten out this 12-gauge shotgun that I was going to intend to protect myself with. At some point during this drug and alcohol fueled psychosis with this gun, my mom flew in and realized something is not right with my daughter. And so she ended up calling the police, and they had come, they had brought their SWAT team, and they had arrested me under the Mental Health Act. Unfortunately, I had made the papers, and they had apprehended me, and they had tried to take me to the local psych ward. Um, and I believe the nurse was trying to kill me. Um, and my whole plan was I was going to escape through the ceiling tiles. I was trying to kick down the door. And then eventually this was after a long period of time. And then eventually I had settled enough that the nurse was able to give me a sedative, which I slept it off. And then the police took me to cells. So then I had some charges, my first set of charges, gun charges. And so that was my last detox, was in cells, non-medical detox. And by this point, I hadn't showered for 5 or 6 days. They wouldn't give me a shower. They wouldn't let me brush my teeth. I was in a psychosis. I was extremely angry. I was wrapped in a sheet trying to find books for pillows and just trying to endure the moment. All in the while, I was still in a psychosis. The lights were speaking to me. Thought I was going to be murdered, and they eventually let me out on bail. And by this time, it had been a long time since I had showered, brushed my teeth. I was just filthy, dirty, absolutely unhinged, or no contact from reality. And the reason I knew, though, like, I had this moment where I was talking to my mom because the police had let me out of my cell to make a phone call. And so I had gone and called my mom, and I was telling my mom, my car's been stolen. She's, no, it's not. I have the keys here. And I trusted my mom. And so that was the first insight I had into this might not actually be happening. And so slowly after that, I was able to start getting some contact with reality and starting to realize I've been in a psychosis. I've been really ill. So much of this isn't true. And so I eventually got let out on bail. And at that point in time, when I was in my cell, I had this moment. I, I decided that I wanted to kill myself. So I was trying to see if I could find anything in the cell in order to be able to slit my wrists with. And I couldn't. But I had this one moment as I was doing so, and it was like I could just see the death of all my dreams. And ironically, one of the last classes that I'd taken in university was a graduate class on the prison industrial system. Part of my distress being in this prison cell was I knew how many doors were going to close to me if I continued down this path. I knew what marginalization and entrenchment and discrimination for people with criminal records looked like and how difficult rehabilitation could be from that point on. And so I had that awareness. I would sit on the floor of these drug houses with these individuals having these conversations about marginalization, about these pieces, right? And I knew, I was aware. And so I had this moment, though, where I could see the death of all my dreams. And I knew metaphorically, physically, I had to make a choice of whether I wanted to live or die. And something happened in that moment where I understood that recovery was like a marriage. It was, it transcended feeling. It was a commitment. It was an action and motion circumstance. It was all transcendent to that larger commitment. And that was really, I would say, the one of the most crucial pieces of my story, just in that moment, where I sat down on myself. And it was almost like a spiritual moment. I had gone through court, gone through bail, came home, and decided that I was going to go to treatment. So I had chosen a privatized treatment center. And 2 weeks later, I had packed a suitcase, and all my good girlfriends and family had kind of rallied around me to help keep me clean and sober and out of trouble for those 2 weeks so that I could get on a plane and go to treatment. And I thought I was going for 40 or 50 days, but it wasn't. I'm still out here in this province, and it's been 6 years later. And so I wasn't able to go home, and I had to make some really hard choices through my treatment of whether or not I was going to put myself at risk again. And so I decided to stay out here. And realistically, I didn't feel like I had anything to go back to, anyways. I didn't like my life there, I didn't like existence. And when I got to treatment, it was day 2. I had met my counselor, and I think I had threatened to punch her in the face. I was really angry. I think I spent the first week of treatment just terrorizing the staff and over stupid stuff for no reason. Just the over, I couldn't wear my short shorts. I look back on that now and I'm like, wow. But anyways, so I got there, touched down, terrorized everyone, and had a really rough start. And I can say I didn't make a lot of friends there for that reason. It wasn't until I had to start doing the work, and treatment taught me how to transcend my emotions. It treated me with a biopsychosocial approach. The psychiatrist there put me on the correct medication that I needed to be on. And I can remember the first moment that PRN that they gave me as a mood stabilizer hit me. It was like all that stone inside of me, inside of my heart, just melted. I could just feel it. I was in the shower. And it was really then that I was able to start doing the work. I was just so emotionally unregulated. I could not get it together emotionally. I was so high and low all the time and just so full of anger and rage and hate and very much just so afraid in order to be vulnerable with people that I would be taken advantage of. And it was at treatment that I was able to have a basic understanding of my emotions, of my disorder. I was able to learn about vulnerability, how to connect with my body. I was able to begin having compassion for myself. And I was so terrified to let people in, to let people see me, because I was convinced that if they saw who I really was, then no one would love me. And I was actually able to see that when I was vulnerable, when I was authentically me, when I was kind, it actually allowed people to be present with me, and I was able to start building a relationship. But it was so terrifying to break down those walls. And when I was just about to leave treatment, I found out it was like 2 or 3 days before I was leaving treatment, and I was all set up to go to a recovery house in Surrey. And I had gotten the news that my dad had stage 4 cancer. And so I left treatment with that. hanging over my head, and I had gone to this recovery house, and I had gotten kicked out within a week once again because of my anger. And the man who ran that treatment center, at one point, I remember him saying, "You're not going to make it." And for the longest time, just to spite him, I continued on my recovery just with the recollection of those words. But he did something for me that was just super transformative, and he set me up with a woman who ran a recovery house a ways away, and she came and picked me up, and that was honestly the best thing he ever could have done for me. And it was in that recovery house that I was able to start finding a home. And this woman that ran this recovery house, I'm forever, like, just so grateful to her. She said to us, "You're out of treatment, you gotta do something. So you can get a job, you can volunteer." And I started volunteering, and I started volunteering at a homeless shelter with another girl in early recovery, and it really triggered her, but I just absolutely loved it, and I kept going back and kept volunteering, and it was just I loved it. I loved being able to go in there and take care of people, to be a part of something, and I just remember feeling such incredible joy. And I have so much gratitude to the shelter guests in my early recovery, because being able to help take care of them really was a gift to my recovery. It was an act of service that really kept me sober, clean and sober, and it also paved the way for my career later in recovery. And so after that, the shelter hired me, and then I gotten to work in another shelter as well. So I had two jobs. And by this time, I was well enough to go back to school. Um, and life started getting good. And so I really loved working in the shelter. I loved working with houseless people. I loved working with other addicts and alcoholics and other people that had mental health issues. I just felt so much community. And it was when I was at a training for one of these shelters that I was headhunted to apply for a job in the local government. And so I wasn't interested at first. Eventually, I decided I was going to apply, and I got a job casually, and that allowed me to make a better wage and feel like was now starting to have a purpose. My trauma symptoms were healing, and so I didn't have as much sharp edges to myself. And with the healing of those trauma symptoms, it allowed my career to blossom and begin to bloom. I was also I had my own place at this point, and that provided me with a lot of healing, a really safe place to just, for the first time, be wherever it was that I needed to be. And it was still really hard because I was lonely a lot, and there was a lot of challenges. A lot of my friends that I had gone to early recovery with, we had a falling out, or they had died, they had relapsed. And so the community that I had come to treatment with, or like after treatment with, was dwindling away. And so that was really hard. And so I was having to grapple with these losses because I had made friends. I'd feel like I had a purpose, and then I would have so much grief and loss afterwards when they didn't make it. All the while, throughout these 2 years, I had my counselor that I was working with, and he really had this directive approach that I needed, and I couldn't steamroll her. And this counselor I had been with from treatment, and then but also transitioned after aftercare to working with her. And so I had this one person that was able to walk beside me, but also set some really hard boundaries with me and give me a directive approach. And I really needed that, and I really benefited from weekly sessions. And so I had my early recovery all set out, and I had 2.5 years of counseling. My recovery was going well. I was adding different pieces into my recovery. Like at this, I was going to meetings sometimes. I went to them a lot in early recovery. I was doing things like exercising, I was building my career, I had gone back to school, I was attending counseling, but my mental health was still really bad for about 3 years afterwards. And at one point, I had, even though I hadn't relapsed, I had landed back in this recovery house for just a short stay just to stabilize my mental health because it was just this trudge. Like, and my counselor had always told me, this is the hardest part. You've got to put in the work, you're building the foundation, and one day it will pay off. And so it just didn't feel like it was paying off. But she had always told me, you never pick up based on an emotion. A craving is an emotion, like a heightened situation, a bad situation is an emotion. And so I just kept holding on. And there was some days, some weeks where I would have a significant mental health crash. And I'd just be in my apartment alone for a week with the curtains drawn, like crying and just like waiting it out. There was a lot of beauty and enrichment in my life, but there's still a lot of like challenges, right? Because I was still working on the symptoms of emotionally regulating and working on like my trauma from abandonment and binge eating. I had definitely had an unhealthy relationship with food. Um, and so, and just all of these different pieces, the loneliness, all of it. And meanwhile, my dad had quit drinking at this point and he had 2 years left. And working with my counselor, I had realized that this is my chance to have him pass with no regrets. And this was my chance to try and go first. That even though he was my parent, even though he was an alcoholic and he began all of this, I could go first. And so I tried going first and I began trying to build a relationship with him. And so I would go home frequently and I would try and help my family take care of him. I'd do what I could. I'd try and go out for dinner with him, spending more family time and just addressing all of those pieces instead of raging and abusing him and just taking no accountability and no responsibility for the negative that I brought into our relationship, especially as an adult. I started doing that. And so I started treating him with respect. I began living in amends to him. And when I became an addict and an alcoholic, it was a gift to me to be able to see actually all the things that he did right as a father in spite of his alcoholism, his addiction, and cross addictions that he had that I knew about, picking up prostitutes and like he was a hoarder. He hoarded industrial equipment. And so all those pieces and I just went first. And it was difficult, but what it did was provide me with the opportunity to make sure that for the first time in my life, on some level, I was able to accept him for who he was. I was able to see all the things that he did right. And I was able to make sure that when he passed, I didn't have any regrets. And so I did that. And it was one of the greatest gifts of my recovery, and it was also a lot of inspiration for me to stay clean and sober and to keep on the path because I knew that these were some of the biggest moments of my recovery, and I didn't want my family to have any more stress than because by this time I'd begun to do enough work in my counseling that I was able to start understanding how my addiction had affected them, but how my disorder had affected them as well. And I was also able to take some of that anger that I had towards my mother, and I was so angry at my mother for so long that she didn't divorce my dad, that I was just living in this, right? In this chaos. And so I was really able to see all the strength that she had inside of her in order to be able to keep this incredibly toxic household together. And so I was able to start seeing outside of myself and seeing good things about my family. And that was really a gift because part of my recovery was built on my own accountability. I am responsible for my actions. And I'm only responsible for them. It doesn't I have to be able to navigate myself and make healthy choices with integrity. And that means being accountable. And so I use those principles in order to be able to try and salvage my relationship with my father in his last couple of years of life. And I'm so grateful now. It was such a gift and it was worth all the work of living in amends. And I get to have those conversations with him, saying, I'm sorry for how I treated you and not expecting an apology back, but just being able to be present, be accountable for me, and to be there to take care of him for the hospital visits and like all of those different pieces. I remember I had a conversation with my counselor in my dad's hospital room when he was palliative. And I was the last person to see him before he died, actually. And the night that he passed away, I had gone home about 11 o'clock, and the nurse had called myself and my mom at 5 a.m. about. And by the time we got there to the hospital, he'd gone. But I was there with him. I was helping take care of him. I was accountable. I had a relationship with my father for the first time in my life. When I went home, we'd go out to dinner and we'd talk and we'd have these great political debates. And it wasn't a fight every time we saw each other. And it was truly a gift. And so he passed, and he was passing just as I was finishing this first master's degree. My father had died November 15th, 2019, and I was still working for this government agency at that point in time. I'd start working in outreach. I'd worked in the hospital. I'd worked with people with other heavy access one mental health issues like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, other comorbidities. And I had decided, thanks to my counselor, that I would go on and I would get a second master's degree as a counselor. And my counselor was really my inspiration for this. If it wasn't for her, I would not have gone and gotten this second degree as a counselor. And oddly enough, recovery had given me the tools that I was able to be a straight A student. And my confidence in my own ability had just skyrocketed. And it was really remarkable because I didn't expect that I would have as much skill inside of me as I did to be able to do that schoolwork confidently. So it was the secondary gift of recovery that enabled me to get into this grad program and do as well as I was doing. And at the end of my first master's degree, I ended up submitting publishing a peer-reviewed paper on the opioid crisis in Canada, looking at Portugal as a model, which I was really proud of, really excited. It was my first published peer-reviewed article. And so then I transitioned into this secondary master's or program, a master's in counseling, all the while working on my recovery. And it was during this time, 2020, actually, specifically, that I had started doing a lot of my own healing work with psilocybin, large doses of psilocybin. And it was a significant turning point in my mental health and my recovery. And because even throughout recovery, I still had these elements of treatment resistant depression. And so it cured that. I had a lot of cravings around year 3, year 4. It dialed down all of these cravings that I had and really took me to a new depth and happiness in my soul and my being. That was a really fundamental turning point. So by the time I was going into the second master's degree, I was in a pretty good mental and emotional headspace, with the exception that I had made this best friend. She was my neighbor in this apartment building, and she had a traumatic brain injury many years ago. And she'd lived in pain and suffering for 23 years, but she's this incredibly beautiful soul. And I just loved her more than anything. I, and at the beginning of my practicum in my master's, she had decided that she was going to participate in the main program, and that she had just, the medical intervention had really, they couldn't help her, and she was just in such pain and such difficulty. And this is something that was going on in my personal life throughout my master's degree, and really just being able to walk her through that process, being able to help her procure your resources, and then at the same time, just coping with the fact that I'm going to lose my best friend, right? She's choosing to go. And it was difficult. And so when I began my practicum, we were just, we were, she was just going through these final processes, her last days of life before she had chosen her day to die on the beach. And so that really how I began my practicum, but I was still able to, through recovery, healing, through employing all of these tools, the gifts of recovery, I was able to manage all of that. And I was still able to show up and be pretty high functioning as an individual, right? Like I had gotten enough help at that point that I was able to emotionally regulate. I was in control of my emotions, my body. I wasn't afraid to be in my body. I wasn't afraid to be inside of my mind. I had faith in myself. I had self compassion. I was able to understand what my feelings were. I had all of this rich psychoeducational background on what trauma was. I've done some trauma therapy. Like I had all of these resources that were on enough time under me that I was in a pretty healthy place despite this. And then I finished my practicum. And throughout this process, I had also began dating someone, and he ended up becoming my fiance through this. And I was finally able to have a healthy relationship. I had done enough work that I was able to show up to the table as a whole human being. I was able to hold space for someone else besides myself because I didn't have all of these trauma symptoms going on around me, inside of me. I wasn't afraid all the time, and that was probably the quintessential emotion of my life was fear, just this overwhelming fear of people, fear of vulnerability. And so I was actually able to come to the table as a whole healthy person. To I'm able to regulate my emotions. I am able to see another person's perspective. I am able to apologize, be accountable. I am able to be secure in myself, to not have any worries about whether my partner is going to come back or whether he's going to abandon me. No anxiety attacks, like nothing. I was actually able to, at this point, to be a whole healthy partner for someone. And there was a time where I didn't ever think that was going to be possible. I was just mind blowing because I was so sick and I was so ill. But my counselor kept telling me if you just keep doing the work, gets better with time and gets better with time. And there were so many times where I just had to trust her. It was that complex trauma that was inside of me. It prevented me from being able to discern people and situations and what was safe and what was not. It was so easy to just go back to that black and white thinking. And I just had to trust her. And she was right. And the healthier I had become, the more healing that I had done, the more I was able to emotionally regulate and trust myself and learn what boundaries were and begin to love myself. And just as I was not needing 3 hours to get ready and putting on hair extensions and fake nails and fake eyelashes and high heels just to leave the house to feel okay, all of those things just came together. And so, as my trauma symptoms were healing, I had these wonderful and different parts of my life. I was going through my depression had finally lifted thanks to the psilocybin. I was able to emotionally regulate thanks to these pharmaceuticals and this great psychiatrist at the treatment center that put me on the right medications. I was able to learn about my emotional processes. I was able to be accountable. I was able to figure out how to deal with uncertain situations that I didn't feel comfortable in, but retain my integrity and to have internal strength. So I had all these like really great pieces in my life where I was able to overcome challenges in adversity. My resilience had become so much higher than my trauma. And now I have a life better than anything that I ever imagined or dreamed of. I am so grateful for my health. I just passed my 6 years clean and sober. I'm also now co-facilitating the outpatient addictions program where I work, which is just incredible. And it's just like this full circle moment because when I was ill, I had gone to this outpatient day program alongside my attempts to go to my doctor, going to detox multiple times, those pieces. And so to come full circle and to sit around the table as a co-facilitator and not as a participant is just incredible. The gifts of recovery, it's just so mind-blowing. I'm able to have this wonderful relationship with this loving man and live in these new ways, right? I live close to nature, in the woods, off grid, really honoring my own sense of spirituality and just detached from capitalism in so many ways where I am just in tune with the land in a more simplistic way. And that contributes to my health in so many different ways. I have better relationships now with my family than I ever have throughout my entire life. And so it's just been remarkable. And so I went from so many years of struggle to getting really sick and having my life burned down around me to this beautiful life where I feel empowered. I love myself. I feel good about myself. I have faith in myself. I am able to help other people. And now I'm able to help create a safe space for other people who are struggling. And that is just such a gift. And there were people that went before me, people that were involved in my treatment process that had lived experiences. They're in recovery themselves, and they were just so inspirational. It was so meaningful to be able to have that lived experience from these other healthcare providers. Because there was always this saying, trust the process. If I trusted the process and they were right, it can get so much better and life can get better. It's just amazing to be able to be healed from my CPTSD, to be able to heal the symptoms of borderline personality disorder, to have I don't have crippling anxiety or depression anymore. I enjoy life. I don't feel this chronic emptiness inside of me anymore. I have this beautiful career. I have hobbies. I've been able to work on these different pieces of myself, and it's just been it really is possible to change. And like I still have challenges in life and life on life's terms still happen, but life is just so much better now than I ever thought it would be. and it was worth all the work. There were so many things that I didn't know that would turn out while I was going through this process. Like when I went through my first set of charges, gun charges, and I stayed clean, I stayed sober, I did the work. My charges were dropped, they were removed from my record. So I was able to have this career. I was able to just do the next right thing, and things worked out. And yeah, I never would have guessed that it would be possible to have a healthy life and that my life would be as good as it is now. And I'm grateful.
Wow, Anna, you just had me on the edge of my seat the whole time. And I'm really grateful for how brave you've been today, for sharing your story to those out there who might be in those dark places, who don't know that it can get better, who believe that this is the end for them. And so hearing what you've gone through, and boy, you've gone through a lot. Um, it is possible to get well, and you're a standing testament to that. The fact that you're alive, I think, is incredible. And I've said this before, but a miracle in a lot of ways. And so I'm really moved. I've always been moved by your persistence and your dedication to your recovery. And I'm just honored that you were willing to share your story today. I do have a few questions for you based on what you were saying. And I'm going to go back all the way to the beginning when you were little and you're being raised in this household where you have an alcoholic father. There's a lot of conflict, fighting, and you're really angry. You don't know how to cope. And so I'm wondering, when you look back there, what you needed your little girl to know, or what you as a little girl needed at the time that you couldn't have.
I think we needed validation. Part of the theory about how borderline personality disorder forms is that it's social and it is perhaps, or sorry, it's environmental and perhaps genetic, but it can also happen in the context of an invalidating environment. And so what I needed was validation. What I needed was presence. And I think my little girl needed a safe place to feel normal in her pain and her feelings, and that these are experiences, these are feelings, these are things people go through, and they exist, and it's okay to talk about them. It is okay to name them. There's nothing shameful about it. And so I think that's what my little girl needed. My little girl needed validation.
Yeah. And this is a really excellent message, an educational message to people out there who are not only the children or youth who are living in families where they're not heard and they're feeling very angry, who might listen to this story, but also parents who are living with adolescents or children who are very angry. And I think it's an important message all around that we're able to pay attention to feelings, not shame them, talk about them, allow them to be there, and validate what's happening for that person. Really incredible message. Thank you. Um, can you tell us a little bit about your understanding of higher power and how that helped you through your recovery, if applicable?
Um, well, I don't have any concrete beliefs around deity or a monotheistic religion or a polytheistic religion. My sense of spirituality is really based around nature and around energy. And I would probably be considered more agnostic. I suspect there's something out there. I'm not sure why, but I'm open to the possibilities. And I think spirituality for me is a connection to those deep, unconscious, multifaceted pieces of my being and the existence. And I don't necessarily know what that is, but I do believe that there is an ascension and that manifests in love, in wholeheartedness, in healing, in trust in self, in self confidence, and feeling of being empowered, um, in the manifest kindness and peace, just being in my body and my mind. And sometimes my spirituality is just being out on the beach with my feet in the ground, looking up and wondering about the beauty of nature and the universe. And that's it. That's my spirituality. It doesn't, no. They don't necessarily have a desire to really figure it out or name it because I'm okay with things being abstract and unknown.
Beautiful. Do you think that aspects of what you've just described, like love and peace and being grounded on the earth and nature, do you think that these aspects or others have contributed to your ongoing recovery?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's I think the doorway to darkness is through pain, but pain can also bring awakening, spiritual awakening, and it can bring healing and renewal and this growing the spirit and the soul and the mind consciousness, if you will. And so I think it's been that awakening through darkness.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Anna. Was getting the diagnosis of BPD for you, either at the time or through your life since, has it been helpful at all in your recovery, in your healing?
It has been helpful in lots of ways. It allowed me not to feel alone, that other people had similar pieces. It was really helpful to me as someone that didn't understand the stigma of BPD and what is the misunderstandings in the community, the psychological community. So it was really helpful for me in my early recovery. Now that I am a clinician, now that I am involved in professional mental health spaces and am much more aware, I'm much more aware of the stigma, and that has not been helpful. Stigma is so harmful, and there's so many negative messages that come with borderline personality disorder, that people don't want to get better, that people are manipulative in their pain, that people can't get better, or for example, that DBT is the only healing modality for borderline personality disorder. Recovery is absolutely and completely possible. It is it is a disorder of pain. There is so much pain in it. And so it was really helpful to me in unlocking some of the key pieces in my journey. But sometimes now it feels like an albatross around my neck. And that stigma still affects me, even as a provider. And so part of the reason I made that diagnosis today is because I want other people to see and know that recovery is possible. It is not a life sentence. It is possible to heal from it. It's possible to get better. It's possible to be able to create healthy relationships, to heal from those abandonment issues, to work on your eating and like all those other symptomology pieces, the substance use, the suicidality. And so that's really why I am being so forward with it and sharing my story, is because I think there needs to be more voices saying this is treatable. It is not a life sentence, and holding care providers accountable who are entrenched in stigma and are making it more difficult for people to come forward because they have their own unexamined biases, or they believe a lot of these stereotypes and these pieces.
Said, and honestly, what better person to do this than you, who's lived it and you know it and you've experienced these biases, right? And now the fact that you are a provider and you're an educated provider at that, I think you're in an excellent position to be able to hold people accountable who have these biases that are projecting them to the world. So more people can not only get assistance, but ask for assistance who aren't, right? Yeah. I remember when you were talking about getting to know this gang leader and that you were just enamored by this person. And I'm it brings me back to when you were young and you didn't feel validated and you didn't feel seen or heard. And I'm wondering if there's a correlation between what you needed when you were little and what he gave you, despite the fact that you were both in addiction and up to no good, it sounded like, but there was something he gave you at the time that made you want to really stick with him, even though it was a path that was dangerous for you. Can you tell us what it was that he gave you at that time?
What he gave me, he saw beyond the illness. He met me at one of the most darkest times in my life, and he could still see me. And so he gave me a validation. And so it was this untreated childhood wound. But yeah, so that validation that I didn't get from my father, those wounds of neglect, it was very much like a trauma bond that was that unconscious wounding that I hadn't healed. But I didn't know that's what caused it or that there was any relationship to it. I didn't have enough of a mental health lens, a connection with my emotions, with some of those psychological pieces to know the intricacies of that. I knew that I was always attracted to emotionally unavailable men, but I didn't understand. It didn't make sense to me that I had to heal those pieces of myself first before I could be present in a relationship with someone that was also emotionally present. And my fiance that I have now is emotionally present. He's present with me. He shows up every day, but I wouldn't have been able to receive that when I was ill. I can receive it now because I'm healthy. And unconsciously, it was that validation, but it was also that circular story of old wounds, right?
It really goes to show that what we need as little ones, as we grow up, it doesn't go away. Like this core of you needed that validation, you needed to be seen for who you are, not your behavior. Or at the time when you were really young, you didn't have the diagnosis. But even as you got older, even after you've had the diagnosis, you needed people to see through the diagnosis, see you as a human. And it also goes to show that it doesn't actually matter what that person is up to, what is happening for them, or what if they're into drug use or crime. It doesn't actually matter if they're seeing you through your diagnosis and they're being there with you and they're allowing you to be vulnerable and being yourself. Then it's, of course, a no brainer that somebody would gravitate to that lifestyle because that's the person who's being there for them finally after all these years. Makes so much sense. You also said that you were willing to violate all your values while you were with him. You were stealing, you were pawning things, you were doing all kinds of things that hadn't been doing before. And I wonder if that goes along the
He
same lines of that you were receiving what you needed your whole life from him.
Because he never encouraged me to do those things. That was addiction and compulsion. That was the compulsion inside me, that siren song of addiction that made me violate my values. That had nothing to do with him. That is addiction that will strip you from your values because it is that strong. It destroys communities, it destroys families, it destroys individuals, and it will part a person from their values. So that wasn't him. That was my addiction.
You were also talking about once you were in the treatment center and you were on the right medications, you said there was a part within you were in the shower, you said, and the stone in my heart started to melt away. Now, you attributed that to the medication that you were on, but that melting of the stone is a long, drawn out process. And I'm wondering what other aspects, whether it be your counseling relationship, the work you did there, and or the treatment that you went through, what other aspects contributed to that melting away process for you?
You're right. That melting away process, it's a long process and it's multifaceted. My counselor was fundamental to that. She was just so integral in my well being. I had trust in her. And so when she gave me the psychoeducation and the skills that I needed in order to be able to get through the tough times, I also wasn't able to I had to learn boundaries in that relationship. And it was so my counselor was just, and that relationship, that deep relationship, that trust, that was so important. It was fundamental. And then on top of those skills and psychoeducational pieces, one of the most important pieces that I have learned is how to identify my emotions, the difference between a thought and an emotion, how to connect with those emotions in my body, what to do with them so that I can process my emotions in a safe space and a self-compassionate space. So that has been so important. And then emotional regulation skills, understanding what goes into that. Sleep, how important sleep is for emotional regulation, the importance of creating a balanced life, being able to check in with myself and know myself well enough to know, okay, so I need to get out and exercise. I need to get 8 hours sleep. If I'm cranky, have I fed myself today? Am I eating nutritionally balanced food? Am I just eating a diet of simple carbs? And I giving myself enough fresh fruits and vegetables? Am I eating the rainbow? Am I meditating? Meditating has been so important in my recovery. It has been super, super important in teaching me how to self regulate and self soothe. I love my anxiety blanket. I really love that. It helps bring me down, something that I use a lot. I also like to do a lot of smudging and that cleansing, those quiet moments, and just those principles around accountability that always bring me back to my accountability instead of blaming others or feeling disempowered has been incredibly important because with my own accountability, then that means that I can overcome a lot, right? I am in the driver's seat, even if something happens to me that I don't necessarily like. I know that I'm able to make choices to build resilience and to climb those mountains. Self care, just a myriad of self care. Can Self care has just been so important, but also connection. One of the things that I've battled the most in my recovery is loneliness and loss. So building those relationships, those connections, it's been so important to have other people in recovery around me, people that get it, people that are trying to heal, and people that have all these spots and they're not afraid to just be spotted and have that be normal and okay. And psilocybin has been an important part of that process. So I've used lots of different tools in my healing path, but really being able to act in opposition to how I feel has probably been one of the most important pieces because then I'm able to enact change. And you have to act your way into recovery. You can't think your way into it. And you have to be able to sit in discomfort in order to create new changes. Because it's going to be hard, it's going to be uncomfortable. And if you're always avoiding those feelings of discomfort, then how do you act in opposition to how you feel? You avoid, and then your life gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So you have to be able to be uncomfortable.
And it's obvious that through your discomfort that you really did trust the process. And you we always say we're currently in recovery. We're never fully recovered, but you are really rocking being in recovery, it seems. Yeah.
That's true. I only have today, I have 24 hours. I am so grateful for my health, but I know that I can go back to addiction. I can go back to just like an absolute traumatized son that's terrorizing people and that can't function because she's too high and drunk. Like that can be my tomorrow. I have today only, and I really stayed humble about how much time I have. And it's such a powerful disease. I try not to underestimate it because as soon as you underestimate it, that's when those pieces can come and slip in. And it's just, it is powerful, and addiction does deserve respect because of how powerful it is and how detrimental it is to people, to families, to communities. And I don't ever want to think that I've got it.
I think that's wise because I've always learned and taught that once we think we've got it figured out is when we start to become at risk for falling back into it. We must stay humble in this process to keep ourselves well, right? Yeah, I have a couple more questions for you before we close. It sounds that through the process of your dad going through this cancer and passing away, that it was incredibly important to you that you were able to build that relationship with him that you never had. And I'm wondering, as you went through that and you were there with him, you were the last person to see him alive. I'm wondering, did you ever think, now that you look back, that that was possible considering the environment you grew up in and how you fell into addiction and what your life entailed back then?
What would I never, I would have never ever thought that I would have compassion for my father. I hated him. I hated him so much. There was so much pain there. It really truly is a testament to the gift of recovery and a gift of how much a person and their life can change when applying these um, psychotherapeutic principles, right? The process really does work. And so it was a gift, just an incredible gift. And I don't regret a minute of it. I was able, when he passed, I was able to bury my father with no regrets. And we couldn't, we couldn't go back and change the past and all of the years and all the abuse and all the hurt words, but we were able to salvage a relationship. And I really enjoyed my time with my father. Being able to come home and have him pick me up at the airport, being able to go out for dinner with my aunt and my mom and my grandmother and have these talks about politics and this and that, being able to take him to his treatments and take him to the doctor's appointments. And that was just so important. It was just truly a gift.
And without your recovery, I think you never have had that.
I wouldn't have, because I would have always been expecting him to go first. And also, I wouldn't have, I don't think, been able to accept him just as he is. Part of the reason why I think our relationship was able to heal was I was able to meet him where he was at. He was just who he was, but I was able to hold space for him. I was able to see all the things that he did right, even as an active alcoholic. And I was able to emotionally manage myself because I had enough self esteem that if I didn't get the response that I wanted from him, I could hold space for that. It didn't shatter me. I didn't, it didn't then come at the belief that I wasn't worth getting to know and that I wasn't, my value was in question because he couldn't be present or anything other than he was in that moment. And that was, I think, a lot of the nucleus for us being able to build a relationship. I wasn't as reactive. I was able to see him and be grateful for who he was. And I was able to just know that I was, even though I was the child, and even though I was born into an unhealthy situation, I was an adult and I was responsible for who I am and what I said and what I did. And I was accountable. And that I was accountable for all those ills and the way I treated him as well. And so I just focused on my own accountability and what I wanted to be able to give to him as a living amends. And I owed that to all of my family. I had to go first. And I had to prove through time and effort, dedicated effort and change, that I meant what I said, that I was coming forward as a different person. I was coming forward with better social skills. I was coming forward when I had made a mistake saying, yeah, I did that and I'm really sorry. Or I did that. I'm confused. I don't know what else to do. I'm stuck.
Thank you, Anna. What an inspirational story. Hand down. I give you so much credibility for everything that you've gone through and how you fought to save your own life despite not being afraid of death and being suicidal a lot of the time. And you really came out of it. And it looks to me now that you wouldn't change your life for anything at this point. Is that true?
Life is pretty good. It is, honestly, my life is better now than it ever has been. And I am often now inclined to believe that the addiction, it was a gift because if I was just having complex trauma and borderline personality disorder, I might never have been able to get here. And I kept showing up to therapists, not getting where I needed to go. So I try and think of this destruction of my life through addiction as a gift because I was able to get a chance at building a life that I actually want to be present in. And I didn't think that was possible before. And I tried to be grateful. I can actually be present in my own body. I like myself enough now as a human. I never thought that was possible.
Well, so as we wind down here, I'm wondering for all of those people who are listening, if you have a message for them, those who are struggling, those who don't know how to ask for help, or maybe those who think they don't need help but are struggling, what would be your message to them?
Healing is possible. Healing is a struggle, and there are really hard times with it, but it's worth all the work. And um, it's find community, take that risk, be courageous, talk about how you're feeling, and you might just find that it makes you braver, that you're able to find vulnerability and you're able to find healing. These tools that you are able to learn in counseling with a good counselor, the right treatment plan, it's possible to change your life. And there will be times where you just have to hold on. But there will also be times where there is just so much joy and goodness and love and connection and achievement, and it's worth all the work.
On behalf of this agency and myself, I thank you for being here and for being so brave to share your story and all the details of your story, because what you did today was truly a brave thing. So thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Amanda.